Thank you very much, Linda. And I'm sure you will all agree with me that the presentations by our three distinguished speakers was very informative, very thought-provoking. And as Professor Smith has indicated, we have shared new thoughts on an old institution, and there is a call for a conversation. Let us begin that conversation now by having questions. Would you please identify yourself when you ask your questions? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jatinder Man. I'm a Banting postdoctoral fellow here in the Department of Political Science at the U of A. First of all, I wanted to make a quick comment. Coming from the UK, I'm a firm believer in Westminster-style democracies having a second upper house. But my question is more to do with Australia. So I did my PhD in Australia, and I do comparative work between Australia and Canada. My question is probably most directed at Linda, because I know she's been to Australia and has kind of done some comparative work as well. But, okay, well, at least is knowledgeable. But just, I suppose, also to the rest of the panel. I mean, can Canada learn a lot from the Australian example? I mean, they're both federal systems, similar political histories. And for those of you who don't know the Australian system, they have an elected second upper house, which is elected according to a party list system, equal number of senators from each state, which is equivalent to provinces here, and a smaller number from the territory. So I know it's quite an ambitious model to perhaps follow, but I don't know, I think this certainly should be considered as an option, and I'd just like to hear your thoughts on it.
I completely agree, and should there be a citizens' assembly on the future of the Senate, I would think that the Australian model would be one that participants would want to look at closely for its, it has its problems that are widely discussed in Australia and debated in Australia, but it has its advantages as well, and I think it has to be one of the models that Canada uses, not least because of the similarities between the two countries.
Melissa, care to comment? Professor Smith?
Oh, sorry. Australia's a very different country, and to begin with, Australians are a bicameral people. They have always had bicameralism, even when they were colonies, long before it became a Commonwealth. Only Queensland abolished. Canada, on the other hand, is a unicameral. Canadians are a unicameral people, is my view. That's why we don't have second chambers in the provinces. 5 of the provinces never had second chambers. The other 5 abolished them. If we were so hep on bicameralism, you'd think we might have it in a province, but we don't. Now, I have other theories. I actually think this endless talk about Senate reform is a kind of sublimated Canadian Republican debate. We don't talk about republicanism in Canada. Australians talk about it ad nauseum, right? And it's interesting to compare as to why there are those differences. And obviously, I think it's related to federalism very much. And the reason we have a second chamber at the national level, and why we must have a second chamber at the national level, or there will not be a Canada, is because it is a federation. And those were the terms of that structure for the second chamber, were what was believed in 1864 and 5 to be necessary. And it's hard to see, in my mind, that reasoning is wrong today. And in some ways, it's actually becoming stronger. I know someone in this room was telling me last night that they're working on redistribution. If you think of 5 of the provinces in this country today whose populations are declining relative to the total population of the country, for those provinces, the voice in the Senate is increasing as opposed to their voice in the House of Commons. Saskatchewan being one, and I must say Mr. Wall, who was once a student of mine, may have missed one of my lectures, because I think that he's quite wrong about what is in the interest of Saskatchewan or in the interest of the so-called small provinces of this country. The Senate aids them, and that's one reason it's so difficult to change it. They're not going to change it unless they get as good a deal. So I think, I understand this, that Australia is often held up. I did my own studies in Australia, but I think in many ways it's a false analogy. And the fact that Canada is a double federation, I made that in my, there is no other country like Canada. Canadians don't seem to fully appreciate how distinctive this country is. And having a double federation, it's very difficult to work out agreements that are acceptable, both to the two founding people and to the 10 provinces of the country.
Thank you.
Martin Katz, historian. I'd like to address this question to Laurie Turnbull. She seemed a little pessimistic about the possibility of Senate reform, and I would like to say that if Senate reform is impossible politically, is it possible juridically by having either an amicus motion brought to the Supreme Court or some other petition brought to the Supreme Court to force the Prime Minister to do his duty. Shall is not an indefinite word. It means within a reasonable period of time. And I would like to see the Supreme Court step in and actually force the Prime Minister to appoint the vacant seats. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I didn't really want to suggest that Senate reform was, I guess I might be a little pessimistic, but I don't want to land on pessimism. But yeah, the question of vacancies is very, very interesting, and I checked on my iPhone, and I think there are 17, not 20, so that's my mistake. I think the current of 17 vacancies. I just really don't know how this will be resolved, and politically or otherwise. I cannot personally foresee the Supreme Court forcing the Prime Minister to fill the vacancies. And I also don't know how politically this will play out either, because I think it's safe to say that there will be no vacancies filled before the election, because politically I don't see how Prime Minister Harper could do that. But if the Prime Minister is still the Prime Minister after the election, I don't know how he'll do it then either, because I think then he's really would be under pressure to fill, because then you're absolutely right. Then we're doing an abolition by stealth or an abolition by attrition. And if you think, and yeah, Mulcair is saying this wither on the vine thing, but I mean, what would that look like? You know, at some point you've got 52 senators, you know, because the others have all retired and they're all, you know, because they meet the quota, they're passing judgment on what comes out of the House. Like, that's just bizarre. And we can't really do that. But I also don't know how Prime Minister Harper will be able to explain why, following the fall election, I'm going to fill these Senate seats now, but I didn't fill them before. So I'm not really sure how that happens. I'm not sure what justification he would give politically for filling them later that doesn't apply now.
Yeah, I want us to respond to, I think the pressure would have to come politically and not from the Supreme Court. I mean, this is the government who's asking for a smackdown from the Supreme Court so it can react, to put it bluntly. So there's some pushback from some provinces, particularly Prince Edward Island, which is seeing its number of senators wither. So I think that the pressure will come from the provinces. Whether Mr. Harper will listen, I don't know. But I'm stunned by the remarkable lack of attention to this issue in the media, given the focus on the Senate in recent months. So I would like to see, and also the statement by the leader of the official opposition, Mr. Mulcair, I think is quite irresponsible. So I think it would behoove politicians and political leaders to start talking about the abolition by stealth and speaking against it.
Question perhaps on this side, if you would identify yourself.
Yes, I am Julian Castro-Rea, Associate Professor of Political Science here at the U of A. People, starting with the Right Honorable Kim Campbell last evening, have correctly noticed that there is a problem with the elected Senate in terms of competition of legitimacy with the House of Commons. There's a problem with the partisan nature of the Senate as it is now. But there is a possibility of reform that hasn't been mentioned, which is senators appointed by the provincial governments. This way, you wouldn't have the problem of the elected senators, or the way of doing it, and the issue of the partisanship would be subsumed to the issue of provincial representation, which was, after all, the very reason why the Senate was created in the first place. So other countries in the world, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium partially, do precisely that. So I wonder if the people in the panel would consider this like a good idea for a bold Senate reform. Thank you.
Well, it is a possibility. I can foresee many difficulties with that. Being one, I don't think it's achievable, but it might be one way to go. Someone like George Brown, who's one of the crucial historical political figures of this country, he promoted a unicameral Ontario. It's always interested me, and somebody should write, now I don't have students, I can think of all kinds of theses they might write. And one would be, why was Ontario the most loyal of the colonies of the British Empire, the largest English-speaking colony of the British Empire in 1865, who sees itself as a mirror of England? Why didn't it adopt a bicameral system? That was never proposed. And that one of the reasons was that Brown said the Senate of Canada will deal with minority problems if they arise in Ontario. That's what the role of the Senate is to deal with minority questions. And if the Catholics, or whatever it might be, of Ontario have a grievance, the Senate of Canada will stand there ready to deal with it. We don't need that kind of institution. I find this and it's interesting to me that that was the case, and also that he made that argument, but that nobody's ever kind of picked up on it. So I actually don't think necessarily that the Fathers of Confederation, to a man, actually necessarily would want that kind of the structure the proposal you're suggesting. And indeed, on the part of the smaller provinces, there were many benefits for the small provinces that were formed in 1867, and I think including the Senate itself. So I just don't really think it's really on the cards, but it is a scheme. Yeah.
I think that's an intriguing suggestion. It's certainly a proposal that's been made many times and had a lot of currency. I'm not sure that provincial interests or provincial representation would somehow override partisanship. I would imagine that provincial governments would be interested in partisan appointments. And in the case of Alberta, provincial interests would be conflated with one particular party because of a one-party dominant state. So I have a few concerns about that proposal, but I certainly think it's something that we would need to talk about as one of the really kind of compelling options.
Yeah, like I agree. It would have to be on the roster of things that were under consideration. But I wonder, too, my kind of initial reaction would be, would the provincial appointment process suffer a lot of the same things we've identified as problematic in federal appointments? So, for instance, if they're kind of using the same criteria, if partisanship was a dominant issue, then are we any further ahead? And not that I want to sound pessimistic about that too, but then I just sort of worry, well, if we go through the reform process and people say, well, that didn't really fix anything. You've changed the person doing the appointing, but ultimately it's the same, it's all the same problems, then, what's the point?
May I make one I'm a Nova Scotian by birth. I lived much of my working life in Saskatchewan. Both have not provinces. Those small provinces don't seek that kind of power. What they seek are transfer payments. What they seek is that the central government will protect them, and whether they're right or wrong. But that's true regardless of what party forms the government, whether it was the CCF, whether it was the Saskatchewan Party, or whether it was the Liberals. That they all had, with their views of the central government, were all the same. And I think that's an important point. And when the fellow who mentioned about, I had thought about Australia, one of the huge differences between Canada and Australia is the following, that Australia formed as a commonwealth, as a unity, a continent for a country for a continent, all at one time. In Canada, only 4 provinces formed Canada. The rest were created later. And it's in the creation of those provinces that a lot of the later political difficulties have arisen or are perceived to be such. But Canada was, and this is sort of the imperial theory of that central Canada is an imperial power in the West, but it's very different from Australia in that sense. Had we actually sat down and Canada was a unity in 1865 and said, this is all of it, we have all of our governments, now what are you going to do? But what we did was we had 4, plus the British government, and then you end up with this huge unsettled, unorganized area. And that's part of the problem that the Senate was one to deal with, but also that it's the part of the problem that the Senate encounters continuously.
On to the next question, please.
Mike Burton, I'm a PhD student in the Department of Political Science. So we talked about the property qualification. There's also a minimum or age qualification for Senate appointments. Yeah, so would that be, like, nothing else in Canada requires you to be 30 to sort of do it? So would that be something that could be got rid of unilaterally by the House of Commons? And then the second thing is, I mean, we're talking about all kinds of different ideas for appointment of senators. If a prime minister wanted to, could you do a process of appointment which was simply the drawing of lots? So like a random selection of senators to sit in the Senate.
Who would like to go first? Linda?
I just call on our legal minds here to, I can't remember if the Supreme Court was asked about the age qualification. No? No, so maybe we don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure I'm going to go there, but it's an interesting question. Arguably, we have enough young people in the House of Commons now that maybe it's not. Appointment process by random selection. My instinctive reaction to that is that I would like some kind of screening. I'm not sure I'd like the likes of me in the Senate. But no, seriously, I think that kind of nonpartisan appointment body in the manner that Peter Russell described maybe could take the first crack at it, and then we could have a random selection with, of course, the oversight of the Prime Minister, because to do otherwise would be unconstitutional.
Yeah, Mike, I mean, one thing you probably already know, but Canada's unusual, again, in Western democracies, in that in its lower chamber, its elected chamber, the turnover is very, very high, right? It's very high. Sometimes it's 40, sometimes it's even more %. Now, that doesn't happen in England. It doesn't happen in most countries. So you posit that high turnover with the Senate, on the other hand, which there's no turnover once appointed, right? So you get a very different kind of profile in the two chambers, and certainly in terms of experience, the odds tend to favor the Senate in terms of political knowledge and experience. Just why Canadian in the House of Commons it's so short, it's unclear, but it is, and it's getting shorter.
Hi, I'm Don Padgett. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I was part of Alberta's team in the Supreme Court. I just wanted to comment on the property age and something else. On the property thing, I too was surprised that the court said, yeah, you can do away with that easily. Because if you read the great mass of stuff that was before the court, it was very apparent that one of the main criteria for getting in was having that property. They didn't want it to be the common rabble that I find myself as. And they probably didn't want it people under 35 either, because I think they wanted a real distinction from the common. So to say you can get rid of that a little more easily, I find a bit surprising, but I would think the answer is if you can get rid of the property qualification easily, and that seems to be the case. The age thing, why not? Just sort of by implication, if we're going to overlook the historical importance of both of those criteria, I don't know, then we could have Senator Brazeau appointed at a younger age. I think he was appointed at 35. And we'll all be paying for that until he's 75. But just on the other thing I wanted to comment on, the fact that the Prime Minister hasn't been appointing. There is a challenge in BC to that. And I think it's only at the Superior Court level. Presumably it would be appealed. BC Court of Appeal might someday find itself in the Supreme Court unless someone decided to act on one of the decisions out of BC. It looks very interesting, especially if the Constitution says there shall be an appointment. It's hard to say what shall means in terms of time, but it certainly doesn't seem to mean never, especially if someone says, I'm not going to do it. It kind of flies in the face of the word shall. So it's a very interesting challenge.
I think we have time for one more question or comment, and then we need to wrap up.
A couple quick comments. Back, I think it was in 1992, there was a Senate commission going around the country talking about the GST, and they were taking hearings from Canadians all over the place. I guess I could ask these questions to a couple of our sitting senators. Why doesn't the Senate not do up like a little royal commission sort of and go around asking people what do they want to see in the Senate, come forward with a recommendation, and maybe have the Senate come forward with some boldness on Senate reform, assuming, of course, they're not all in there and saying we're going to make sure that we push everything so that we can keep our nice appointed jobs. Like actually have an open mind. Not that senators don't have open minds, but the ones that are there are actually pretty partisan appointments. Grant there just loves Stephen Harper. I've heard that a few times, so. But going to the other point about the provincial governments being able to maybe appoint senators, then the senator was always his allegiance to the province rather than to a political party, regardless of what political party that was. And Alberta's an anomaly. Most provincial governments change once in a while. They're not normally in there for 44 years.
What's your name?
Oh, sorry, my name is David Fletcher.
Thank you. And as a sitting senator, I can certainly say that I think you will be hearing about from Senator Cowan this afternoon about some of the initiatives that certainly the Senate Liberal Caucus has put forward, and I'm sure that'll be very interesting to hear some of those initiatives. But certainly your idea about senators perhaps putting forward additions across the country, I think is certainly something that's very valuable, and I think that might be very interesting to do. Our time is up. I want to thank once again our distinguished speakers, and I do want to thank those who have participated in asking questions and for your attention and interest. We will be meeting once again at 1 o'clock to continue for panel 3 and 4, and let us continue the conversation during the lunch hour. Thank you.